Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming out tonight, or this afternoon, I guess, still. It's a real pleasure for me to be here. When Sister Rima asked me to come to the event, she explained to me what it was about. And this is something that I think is really important. Some of you may know, I was actually in Australia. I flew in yesterday. I'm supposed to be in Chicago right now for another conference. But because of the value of what I see, of what the ArtLit Festival is, I took a detour to come in through here to do this event, and I'll be flying out to Chicago from here. Because I think that the idea of art and the value of what art gives us is so terribly important. And I think sometimes we take it for granted what it means, whether it's the written word, whether it's the visual image, whether it's music, just the way that these creations that come from our mind, the way they shape, transfer, control society. You're pointing at me? Pick it up? Okay. Am I better? Shape and can be used to control society is just so terribly important. You know, Plato, the great philosopher, writes that the person who tells stories is the person who rules society. Right? That it's all about shaping the narratives. It's all about trying to figure out the way we see the world, and what are the ways in which, when we can tell a story, we can change the way people see the world. There's a great study that just came out. I was reading that people who read, the more people read, the more empathetic they are. That is, the more they feel for other people. That is, that you can have people who read, who see the world in new and exciting ways, because they're forced to walk in somebody else's shoes. And I'm privileged to come after two authors, and I believe there are two more authors speaking after me. You know, and it's wonderful, because I remember growing up, one of the stories, I don't know if they still require you, I grew up in New York, and one of the stories we had to read, one of the books we had to read was Johnny Tremaine. Do they still require you guys to read that? No? Total blank faces? Okay, you can tell who's over 25. Okay. You know, it's a story about a boy growing up during the Revolutionary War period, and I can remember, I must have read that book at least a dozen times, if not more, just going over and over and over and again. You know, I was just in middle school, and trying to figure out what it meant to do what was right. You know, there's a very strong moral undercurrent to the story. And trying to figure out what it meant to do right and be independent and be an adult. And, you know, the strife of those horrible teenage years that were upon us at that time. Mirrored so nicely the Revolutionary War allegory of Johnny Tremaine. But these are ways in which we see the world and change the story. I was in the car ride over, again with many of our authors, and they were talking about challenges of book covers. I don't know how many of you know a book called The Butterfly Mosque. Nobody's heard of this book, Butterfly Mosque? So if any of you read the New York Times, or your parents read the New York Times, there's a woman by the name of Willow Wilson whose book was just profiled in the New York Times Magazine called Aleph the Unseen. It's a science fiction novel. And Willow's previous book was a memoir called The Butterfly Mosque, about her time in Egypt. And I know Willow, and she was sending out different cover variations of the book. The book was called The Butterfly Mosque. And the artist for the book had kept coming up with pictures of this mosque. And these very stereotypical images of what a mosque looked like. You know, it looked like no mosque anywhere that's ever been built, ever, right? But it would fit perfectly. If you saw it, you'd be like, oh, that's a mosque, even though there's no such thing as what these artists were doing. And we were like, this is so stereotypical, it gives the wrong impression, you're gonna get the wrong audience. And the way in which the visual image was telling the story of what people thought would be in the book. You know, this is about her time, her year in Egypt. And so, you know, she kept pushing back with her editor. Her editor wasn't getting it. Finally, she said, let me get somebody who's actually lived in the Middle East to do a cover for you. And, you know, 5 minutes later, this person had just sketched out a picture of a butterfly in a bell jar, right? And there was no mosque on it, because the idea of the mosque wasn't exotic to this person. This person had lived in the Middle East. And so this wasn't this deep focus on, look, the title is The Butterfly Mosque, everybody's going to focus on the mosque part. That wasn't the important part. The important part was the butterfly, which was, I'm sure you all know the story of the hungry caterpillar, right? It was the metamorphosis that was important. It was the butterfly that was important. The mosque was incidental. But to somebody who wasn't so fascinated by the mosque, who didn't see it as exotic, something strange and something different, the story made sense. The story then became paramount. Whereas somebody who didn't understand what people were about, who wasn't actually reading what the story was, but what the title was, that it was the mosque, was this big, exotic, strange thing. So the ways in which we think about art keep changing narratives. I don't know how many of you know, there's a guy by the name of Mos Def, now by Yassin Bey. I don't know if anybody knows him. Anybody? A couple of nodding heads? No? Just, again, over 25. Okay, good. So, you know, one of the fascinating things to me is Mos is a musician, he's an actor. He was Mos Def to me, he's going to stay Mos Def. In 10 years he'll be Yassin Bey, but that's a different story. So, you know, Mos starts as a musician, he's an actor now as well, but, you know, he's a musician primarily. And I give this lecture talking about the impact of Muslim Americans on American, or the impact of Muslims on American popular culture, and I keep talking about Mos, because not everybody realizes Mos is Muslim. I'm like, he begins every one of his albums with the phrase, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful. The album he drops with probably Black Star liner, right? Black Star, as Black Star. He talks about the love the Prophet has for Khadija's first wife. You know, it's really powerful, prophetic, narrative stuff. And people are like, oh, I didn't know he was Muslim. But what is he talking about when he talks about being Muslim if he's not Muslim? Or Lupe Fiasco out of Chicago. Lupe is another very obvious Muslim hip-hop artist. People are like, he's Muslim? Like, words I never said. What is it about? Come on. Like, listen to actually what the lyrics are. And in the same way, these guys are master storytellers, right? And they're not writing on the page, but they're speaking the words and they're telling you their stories. And so the ways in which, when we have to engage with art, we've got to be thoughtful and conscious about it, because the people who are creating the art are being thoughtful and conscious about it. They're trying to create a world for you to step into, to participate in with them. And if you're not participating in it with them, what are you doing? Right? It's like trying to go to the Louvre and taking a bunch of crayons and, you know, scribbling what you see. That's not the engagement that's being asked of you. And so there's something that's incumbent on us as consumers of this art as well, to realize that artists are trying to paint a vision of a world, whether it's aspirational, what they want the world to be, or the types of world that they see themselves in, or to reflect somebody else's reality. But how can we as consumers then participate in that? And I think one of the best ways as a teacher is I try to get my students to create themselves, because if you're not aware of that process, that consciousness that goes into it, you don't know how to read it with that consciousness and that care. So ArtLit is really important to me in that regard, because it causes you to be conscious consumers by being creators, right? And seeing that world around you and seeing the possibilities that are open. There was a piece that was put up by Shazia Sikandar. Shazia was described as a Pakistani artist, now lives in New York, and for a brief time in Germany as well. Talks about the fact that she's absolutely stateless, but if you look at some of her early artwork where she plays with the Persian literature tradition, you know, she's got the Statue of Liberty in hijab, and so what does that mean for her as an artist, right? That she's creating this visual representation and trying to create a world that says, I can be Muslim and I can be American. That is part of the way of opening people's minds and saying, oh, what does it mean to walk in this person's shoes? This woman who is most likely described at some point in her life, and probably still described at some point in her life, as being a terrorist, as being a traitor to the state, as being a fifth columnist. But here she is saying, well, no, I've got this idea that I have no issue here. You know, Salman Rushdie, the author provocateur, says that racism is not our problem, it's your problem. We are simply the victims of it. And Shazia is simply, I think, in her art expressing something similar in the way she depicts herself. So looking at art as a way, looking at art as a way that to reflect on our own insecurities and our own deficiencies. I will leave you with one further thought, that if we go back to Plato, the person who tells the stories is the person who rules society, how can we use art to change our vision of society? Right? My specialty, by the way, in case I don't think it was made clear, I specialize in the way that Muslims use art in America to place themselves in the American mainstream. So this is my area of research. And I primarily look at music, but I've recently been getting into graphic novels and literature. What are the ways in which we can create a different vision of what it means to belong to a society and a culture. Part of it is being active. So I'm a contributor to a volume called All American, 45 Muslim Men on Being American, which is about telling our stories, because if we don't tell our stories, somebody else will. And the story they're going to tell is the story that you're going to see in The Siege, is the story you're going to see in True Lies, is the story you're going to see in, how many, you all know the Disney movie Aladdin, right? You know that the DVD version is different than the theatrical version, right? The theatrical version has really offensive racist lyrics in it that they had to edit for the DVD release because it was just so over the top offensive that they actually had to edit it for the DVD release. And so this idea that Aladdin will tell our story, the theatrical version of Aladdin will tell our story. And so we've got to put our own stories out there. But more importantly, if people don't know your stories, if people don't know what it is you think and what you believe, how are they going to talk to you, right? If somebody else is saying who you are, well, who's going to engage with you? They're just going to engage with somebody else who says who you are, right? Because you're not out there telling your stories. But I think also we've got to look at, again, being conscious of the world around us. How many of you have ever been to Manhattan? Aside from the Manhattanites? Right? Okay, so if you go on 53rd Street and Lexington Avenue, there's a really big building, all right? And it's called Central Synagogue because it's a synagogue and it's in the center of the city. Very simple naming scheme for those of you who haven't been to Manhattan. Central Park in the center of the city. Central Synagogue in the center of the city. Right? That's how you find things. So, Central Synagogue, and it's on this corner. Imagine this is the corner here where Central Synagogue is. Down this street is one of the largest mosques in the city, Midtown Manhattan Mosque. And so you tell people, go to the mosque on 53rd and Lex, and they'll invariably end up in the synagogue because the synagogue looks like a mosque. And the story is that the mosque was built by Hungarian Jews in the early part of the 20th century who built it as an homage to a mosque in Budapest, Hungary, where this community had come from. That this was a recreation of the mosque in Budapest. But the community in Budapest were refugees from the Reconquista, who had built it in the Moorish style from Spain, where they had come from. So you've got this synagogue in the middle of New York City that looks like a Spanish mosque because of this long cultural memory. So looking at the ways in which the world around us reflects the flows and transfers of people, the ways we've been interacting for centuries, right? And that the ideas and the ways in which we're trying to be conscious and intentional in thinking about the ways we need to get along now. Well, we're not actually very conscious and intentional looking at the ways we've gotten along in the past before. And that art has kept that cultural memory alive for us, even though we don't consciously know it. So how do we look at art then to bring that forward and to think about the ways in which we live in society? So show those out to you. I hope you enjoy the rest of the afternoon. And with that, thank you.